The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Ezra McKinnon's weathered shoulders as he knelt beside Thunder's still form, the old mustang's once proud chest no longer rising and falling with the steady rhythm that had comforted him through countless lonely nights. The horse lay stretched out beneath the mesquite tree where he'd collapsed that morning, his bay coat already dulled by the desert dust that seemed to claim everything in this godforsaken territory. "Well, old friend," Ezra whispered, his calloused hand stroking the horse's neck one final time. "Reckon it's just me now." The silence that followed felt heavier than the oppressive heat. For 10 years, Thunder had been his only companion on this remote stretch of land 30 miles south of Copper Ridge, the only living thing that didn't judge him for the choices he'd made or the family he'd failed to save. Now, even that small comfort was gone. Ezra pushed himself to his feet, joints protesting after 53 hard years of ranch work and regret. His lean frame cast a long shadow across the packed earth as he surveyed his modest spread, a weathered cabin, a small corral, and endless acres of scrub brush and red rock stretching toward the distant mountains. It wasn't much, but it had been enough for a man trying to forget. The shovel felt heavier than usual as he selected a spot near the old cottonwood where Thunder used to seek shade during the worst heat of summer. The ground was baked hard as stone, and each strike of the blade sent jarring vibrations up his arms. Sweat soaked through his faded workshirt as he dug, the rhythmic scraping of metal against earth, the only sound breaking the desert stillness. By the time the sun reached its zenith, Ezra had managed to dig barely 2 feet down. His hands were blistered despite the worn leather gloves, and his back ached something fierce. He paused to wipe his brow with his sleeve, squinting against the glare as he looked toward the horizon. Heat shimmers danced across the landscape, making the distant mesas appear to float like islands in a sea of scorching air. That's when he saw it, a small movement near the property line, perhaps 50 yards away. At first he thought it might be a coyote or javelina, but as his eyes adjusted, he made out what looked like a bundle of cloth caught against a cluster of prickly pear cactus. Ezra set down his shovel and walked closer, his boots crunching on the gravelly soil. As he approached, the bundle moved again, and he heard something that made his blood run cold, the weak cry of an infant. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, breaking into a stumbling run. The baby couldn't have been more than a few months old, wrapped in what appeared to be deerskin and traditional Apache cloth. Dark eyes stared up at him from a face burnished bronze by the sun, tiny fists waving weakly. Most remarkably, clutched in one small hand was a single eagle feather, its pristine white and brown markings somehow untouched by the harsh conditions. Ezra looked around frantically, expecting to see Apache warriors emerging from behind the rocks or riding over the ridge, but the landscape remained empty. No horse tracks, no footprints in the hard-packed earth, nothing to indicate how this child had come to be here, alone in the middle of nowhere. "Where the hell did you come from, little one?" he murmured, gently lifting the infant. The baby was lighter than he expected, and clearly in need of water and nourishment. Dark eyes fixed on his face, with an intensity that seemed far too mature for such a young child. The feather remained clutched tight in the baby's grasp, and Ezra knew enough about Apache customs from his years in the territory to recognize its significance. Eagle feathers were sacred, never given lightly. They represented honor, courage, and connection to the spirit world. For an infant to possess one meant this child was important to someone. But why had they been left here? And why so close to his property? As he cradled the baby against his chest, Ezra felt something stir inside him that he'd thought died along with his own son 7 years ago. The child's breathing was shallow but steady, and those dark eyes continued to study his face with what seemed like recognition. "Well, I can't leave you out here," he said softly. "Come on, let's get you some water and figure out what to do next." He carried the infant back toward his cabin, Thunder's burial temporarily forgotten. The baby made soft sounds but didn't cry, as if sensing they were now safe. As they walked, Ezra found himself remembering another time, another child, his son Matthew, who would have been 15 now if the cholera hadn't taken him. The irony wasn't lost on him. On the day he'd lost his last companion, fate had delivered him another responsibility, another chance to fail someone who depended on him. But as he looked down at the small face nestled against his shirt, Ezra McKinnon realized that for the first time in a decade, he didn't feel entirely alone. The question was, what did this Apache baby's presence mean for a white rancher trying to survive in a territory where cultural tensions ran as deep as blood and trust was rarer than water in the desert? Inside his sparse cabin, Ezra set the infant down on his old kitchen table, the same scarred pine surface where he'd eaten. Countless solitary meals. The baby's breathing seemed more labored now, and Ezra's hands shook as he unwrapped the deerskin bundle, revealing a boy dressed in traditional Apache clothing, a small breechcloth and tiny moccasins that looked hand-stitched with intricate beadwork. "You're burning up, little fella," Ezra muttered, feeling the child's fevered brow. He'd helped deliver calves and foals, but a human baby was entirely different territory. His own son had been past the infant stage when cholera claimed his family, and Ezra's wife Sarah had handled most of the child-rearing duties. Water, that was the first priority. He grabbed a clean cloth from his meager supply and soaked it with water from his precious barrel, gently dabbing at the baby's lips. The infant's tongue darted out reflexively, and Ezra felt a small surge of hope when the child began to suck weakly on the damp cloth. "That's it," he encouraged softly. "Easy now." As he worked to cool the baby's fever, Ezra's eyes kept returning to the eagle feather still clutched in the tiny fist. The child's grip was remarkably strong. Every time Ezra tried to examine the feather more closely, those small fingers tightened possessively around the shaft. The afternoon wore on with Ezra, alternating between giving the baby water and trying to remember everything Sarah had once told him about caring for infants. He fashioned a makeshift cradle from a wooden crate, lining it with his cleanest shirt. The fever seemed to be breaking, and the child's breathing had steadied, but Ezra knew this was just the beginning of his problems. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and red, Ezra heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. His blood chilled as he recognized the rhythm, multiple horses moving at a steady pace, not the random gait of wild mustangs. Through his window, he could make out a dust cloud approaching from the north. "Damn," he whispered, quickly covering the baby with a blanket. Visitors were rare on his isolated spread, and they usually meant trouble. The riders materialized out of the heat shimmer like phantoms, 5 men on horseback, their faces hard and suspicious beneath wide-brimmed hats. Ezra recognized the leader immediately, Sheriff Tom Brennan from Copper Ridge, a man whose hatred for Apaches was matched only by his suspicion of anyone who didn't share his views. "McKinnon!" Brennan called out as he reined in his horse near the cabin. "We need to talk." Ezra stepped onto his porch, casually positioning himself to block the view into his cabin. "Sheriff, what brings you all the way out here?" "Apache raiding party hit the Morrison ranch yesterday morning," Brennan said, his pale eyes scanning the property. "Killed Jim Morrison, took his cattle, and burned his barn. We're checking all the outlying spreads, making sure folks are safe." The other riders, Ezra recognized them as men from town, including Morrison's brother Pete, sat silently in their saddles, rifles resting across their pommels. Their faces showed the hard lines of men seeking vengeance. "Haven't seen any Apaches," Ezra said truthfully. "Been busy with my own troubles. Lost my horse this morning." "That old Mustang finally give up?" Brennan's tone held no sympathy. "Probably for the best. Thing was getting too old to be of use anyway." From inside the cabin came a soft sound, barely audible, but Ezra's heart hammered as he recognized the baby's quiet cry. He coughed loudly, hoping to mask the noise. "You feeling all right, McKinnon?" Brennan's eyes narrowed. "You look mighty nervous for a man with nothing to hide." "Just tired from digging," Ezra replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "Sun's been brutal today." Pete Morrison urged his horse forward, his face twisted with grief and rage. "Tom, maybe we should search the place. McKinnon's always been friendly with the savages. Hell, he's the only white man for 50 miles who doesn't shoot them on sight." "I've never been friendly with anyone," Ezra said firmly. "I just mind my own business and expect others to do the same." The baby's cry came again, slightly louder this time. Brennan's head tilted like a hunting dog catching a scent. "What was that sound?" the sheriff demanded. Ezra's mind raced. "Probably a cat got into the cabin. Been having trouble with them lately." But Brennan was already dismounting, his hand resting on his gun butt. "Won't hurt to take a look around, make sure you're safe. These Apaches are getting bolder. No telling what they might try." "Sheriff, I appreciate your concern, but I've got work to do before dark," Ezra said, not moving from the porch. "If I see any signs of trouble, you'll be the first to know." The tension stretched between them like a drawn bowstring. Behind Brennan, the other men were watching intently, and Ezra could see their hunger for violence. They'd lost one of their own, and Apache blood, or the blood of anyone who protected Apaches, would satisfy their need for revenge. Then the baby began to cry in earnest, the sound unmistakably human and impossibly innocent in the charged atmosphere. Brennan's eyes went wide, then hard as flint. "That's no cat, McKinnon. Step aside." "Tom, listen. Step aside or I'll put you aside." Brennan drew his revolver with practiced ease. "Boys, spread out. We're going to find out what McKinnon's been hiding." Ezra's hand moved instinctively toward his own gun, then stopped. He was outnumbered 5-1, and even if he somehow survived the fight, what would happen to the baby? His mind raced through possibilities. None of them good. "All right," he said slowly, raising his hands. "But before you do something you might regret, you need to understand what you're walking into." The infant's cries grew stronger, and Ezra knew there was no hiding the truth anymore. In a territory where Apache and white settlers viewed each other as mortal enemies, he'd just become the most dangerous thing of all, a man caught in between. "Talk fast, McKinnon," Brennan growled, "because my patience just ran out." Ezra took a deep breath and stepped aside, knowing that any further resistance would only make things worse. "The child isn't mine," he said quietly as Brennan pushed past him toward the cabin door. "Found him about 2 hours ago, near death from fever and dehydration." The sheriff's boots thudded heavily on the wooden floor as he entered the cabin, his gun still drawn. The other men followed, their spurs jingling ominously in the confined space. The baby's cries had subsided to soft whimpers, but the makeshift cradle was impossible to miss. "Jesus Christ," Pete Morrison breathed, staring down at the infant. "It's one of them." Brennan holstered his weapon and leaned over the crate, his weathered face a mask of disgust. "Apache brat. Should have left it for the buzzards, McKinnon." "It's a baby, Tom," Ezra said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Whatever else he is, he's just a baby. A baby that'll grow up to murder our children," snarled Jack Henley, one of Morrison's ranch hands. "Should put it out of its misery right now." The casual way Henley discussed killing an infant made Ezra's stomach turn. These were men he'd known for years, neighbors who attended the same church when they bothered to go, yet grief and hatred had transformed them into something barely recognizable. Brennan picked up the eagle feather that had fallen from the baby's grasp, examining it with professional interest. "This is significant," he said grimly. "Eagle feathers don't come from nowhere, they're earned, given as honors. This child belongs to someone important. All the more reason to—" Henley began, but Brennan cut him off with a sharp gesture. "All the more reason to think carefully about our next move," the sheriff said. "If we kill this baby and it turns out he's the son of a war chief, we'll have every Apache in the territory coming for our scalps." The pragmatic calculation in Brennan's voice was almost worse than Henley's raw bloodlust. They were discussing a child's life as if it were a chess piece, weighing the strategic implications of murder. "So what are you suggesting?" Pete Morrison demanded. "We can't just let McKinnon keep it." "Why not?" Ezra interjected. "The child was abandoned. Someone left him to die. I'm not going to finish the job for them." Brennan turned to face him, his pale eyes cold as winter sky. "You have any idea what you're talking about, McKinnon? This territory is a powder keg right now. The army's got 3 columns chasing Nalnish and his warriors all over the mountains, and every settler between here and Tucson is ready to shoot anything that looks Apache." "The baby doesn't look like much of a threat to me," Ezra replied. "Today, maybe. But what about in 15 years? You going to raise him as your own son? Teach him to read and write, take him to church picnics?" Brennan's voice dripped sarcasm. "Or maybe you'll teach him the old Apache ways, how to track a man through desert rock, how to put an arrow through a rider's heart at 100 yards. The baby stirred in his makeshift cradle, tiny fists waving weakly. His fever had broken, but he was still dangerously thin. Without proper care, he wouldn't survive another day in the desert heat. "Look at him," Ezra said softly. "He's dying. Whatever threat he might pose in the future, right now, he's just a sick child who needs help." "McKinnon's got a point," said Doc Hartley, the oldest member of their group. "Boy's in bad shape. Might not survive the week anyway." "All the more reason to let nature take its course," Henley muttered. But Brennan was studying the situation with the calculating mind that had kept him alive through 20 years of frontier law enforcement. "McKinnon, you said you found him near your property line? About 50 yards out, caught against some cactus. No tracks, no sign of who left him?" Ezra shook his head. "Ground's too hard to show prints, and I didn't see any horse sign. Could have been dropped from anywhere within a mile radius." "Interesting." Brennan holstered his gun completely and began pacing the small cabin. "Apaches don't abandon their children lightly. Something drove them to leave this baby here, specifically here, near your place." "What are you getting at, Tom?" Pete Morrison asked. "Think about it. McKinnon's the only white man in 50 miles who doesn't shoot Apaches on sight. He trades with them sometimes, treats them fair when they come around looking for strays. Brennan stopped pacing and fixed Ezra with an intense stare. Maybe someone knew that. Maybe they left this child where they thought he'd have the best chance of survival. The implications of that statement hung heavy in the desert air. If Brennan was right, then some Apache, possibly someone desperate enough to risk everything, had deliberately chosen Ezra as a protector for their child. That's even worse, Henley said. Means they're watching him, probably planning to come back for the kid. Could be a trap. Or it could be an opportunity, Brennan said slowly. A way to open communications with Nalnish's band, maybe negotiate an end to these raids. Pete Morrison's face twisted with rage. Negotiate? Tom, they killed my brother, burned his barn and stole his cattle. You want to sit down and have coffee with the bastards? I want to stop the killing, Brennan replied firmly. And if this baby is our way to do that, then maybe we should think twice before putting a bullet in his head. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. These men had ridden out looking for Apache blood, and now they were being asked to consider mercy for tactical reasons. It went against everything their frontier experience had taught them about survival. Ezra looked down at the baby, who had opened his dark eyes and was staring up at the circle of armed men with what seemed like preternatural calm. The child's gaze fixed on Ezra's face, and for a moment, the rancher felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness. I'll care for him, Ezra said quietly. If you're right about this being some kind of message, then let me be the one to answer it. But I won't hand him over to be killed by men too afraid to look beyond their own hatred. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft desert wind whistling through the cabin's weathered walls. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the world in shades of blood and gold. Soon it would be dark, and in the Apache Wars, darkness belonged to the hunters. Sheriff Brennan made his decision with the weight of a man who'd seen too much violence and buried too many friends. All right, McKinnon, the baby stays with you, for now. 3 days passed in uneasy quiet. Ezra had barely slept, dividing his time between caring for the baby and watching the horizons for signs of trouble. The child, whom he'd begun calling Samuel in his mind, after his own deceased son's middle name, had grown stronger with regular feeding and water, but remained dangerously underweight. On the morning of the 4th day, Ezra was attempting to feed the infant goat's milk from a cloth when he heard the sound that every settler in Apache territory had learned to dread, the rhythmic drumming of unshod hooves on hard earth, approaching fast. He grabbed his rifle and peered through the window, his heart sinking as he counted at least 8 riders emerging from the heat shimmer to the east. These weren't white men, the way they sat their horses, the way they moved as one fluid unit across the desert, marked them unmistakably as Apache warriors. Well, Samuel, Ezra whispered to the baby, who was watching him with those unnaturally alert, dark eyes. Looks like your family's come calling. The war party stopped just outside rifle range, their horses dancing nervously in the desert heat. Even at this distance, Ezra could see they were painted for war, red and black stripes across faces and bare chests, feathers in their hair, weapons gleaming in the morning sun. One rider separated from the group and approached slowly, his hands visible but never far from the war hatchet at his belt. Ezra had seen enough Apache warriors over the years to recognize quality when he saw it. This man rode like he was born on horseback, every movement economical and purposeful. Eagle feathers adorned his long black hair, and the silver ornaments on his shirt caught the light like scattered stars. The warrior stopped 30 yards from the cabin and called out in accented but clear English, "White man, you have something that belongs to us." Ezra stepped onto his porch, rifle held loose but ready, the baby cradled carefully in his left arm. If you're talking about the child, he was abandoned to die. I found him near death from fever. The Apache's eyes fixed on the infant, and Ezra saw something flash across the warrior's face. Pain, perhaps, or relief. You are McKinnon, the one who trades fairly, who does not shoot at shadows. I am. And you are? I am called Iron Wolf. The child you hold is my nephew, son of my sister. The warrior's voice carried the weight of grief. His name is Little Eagle. Ezra felt a chill despite the desert heat. Your sister? Dead 3 days ago, from the white man's spotted sickness. She was too weak to flee when the blue-coat soldiers came to our camp. Iron Wolf's hand tightened on his horse's reins. She made me promise to bring her son to safety, but the soldiers pursued us. We had to leave him where we hoped a decent man might find him. The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. The army had been pushing hard into Apache territory, driving the scattered bands deeper into the mountains. In their desperation to save the child, Iron Wolf and his people had made an impossible choice: to trust the life of their future to a white stranger. "The boy is stronger now," Ezra said carefully. "The fever has broken." "Good." Iron Wolf urged his horse a few steps closer. "Now you will return him to his people." Behind the warrior, the other Apaches sat motionless as statues, but Ezra could feel their tension like heat radiating from a forge. These were men who had lost family, friends, their entire way of life to the relentless pressure of white expansion. Their restraint in not simply attacking spoke to Iron Wolf's leadership and perhaps to Ezra's reputation for fairness. "Will you?" Ezra asked quietly. Iron Wolf's eyes narrowed. "Will I what? Return him to his people? Or will you raise him to be a warrior? Teach him to hate? Send him out to kill and die in a war that's already lost?" The Apache's face went hard as granite. "I speak boldly for a man surrounded by my warriors. I speak honestly for a man who's already buried one son." Ezra shifted the baby to get a better grip on his rifle. "This child has a chance at a different life, a chance to grow up without the weight of vengeance on his shoulders, a chance to grow up as a white man's pet, forgetting his blood, his heritage." Iron Wolf's voice dripped contempt. "Better he should die as an Apache than live as a traitor to his people. Better he should live and make his own choices, when he's old enough to understand them." The standoff stretched between them like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point. In the distance, Ezra could see dust clouds that might indicate more riders, army patrols perhaps, or Sheriff Brennan returning with reinforcements. Time was running out for all of them. Then Little Eagle made a soft sound, and Iron Wolf's expression changed. The baby had reached out with one tiny hand, as if trying to touch the warrior's face across the impossible distance between them. "He remembers," Iron Wolf said softly. "Even so young, he knows his blood." "He's a baby," Ezra replied. "He responds to voices, to movement. It doesn't mean, 'Give him to me.'" The Apache's voice carried absolute command. "I will not ask again." Ezra looked down at the child in his arms, this tiny life that had somehow become the center of a conflict much larger than one man's conscience. Little Eagle's dark eyes stared up at him with that same unsettling intelligence, as if the baby understood exactly what was at stake. In that moment, Ezra McKinnon made the decision that would define the rest of his life. No. The word hung in the desert air, like the echo of a gunshot. Behind Iron Wolf, the other warriors shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward weapons. "Then you choose war," Iron Wolf said grimly. "I choose what's best for the child. And right now, that means keeping him alive, while you and the army kill each other over pride and hatred." "You would fight 8 warriors to keep one Apache baby?" Ezra smiled grimly. "Iron Wolf, I would fight the devil himself to keep from burying another child. The question is, are you willing to kill your nephew to get him back?" The Apache warrior stared at him for a long moment, and Ezra could see the war between duty and love playing out behind those dark eyes. Little Eagle had begun to fuss, sensing the tension around him, and the sound of his cries seemed to cut through both men like a knife. "This is not over, McKinnon," Iron Wolf said finally. "I know," Ezra replied, "but maybe it doesn't have to end in blood." With a sharp gesture, Iron Wolf wheeled his horse around and rejoined his warriors. Within moments, they had vanished into the desert like smoke, leaving only the echo of hoofbeats and the weight of a promise that hung over Ezra's isolated ranch like a gathering storm. As the dust settled, Ezra looked down at Little Eagle, at Samuel, and wondered if he had just saved a life or signed his own death warrant. 2 weeks passed without incident, but Ezra knew the calm was deceptive. Little Eagle, Samuel, had grown stronger, his dark eyes now following movement across the room, and his tiny hands grasping at anything within reach. The child had begun to smile, a sight that stirred emotions in Ezra he'd thought buried forever with his own family. The attack came at dawn. Ezra woke to the sound of splintering wood as his front door exploded inward. Sheriff Brennan stood in the doorway with 6 armed men, their faces grim in the pale morning light. "Time's up, McKinnon," Brennan said, his revolver trained on Ezra's chest. "Army found 3 more homesteads burned out, families murdered. Nalnish is using that baby as bait, drawing us into ambushes while you play nursemaid to his nephew." Ezra sat up slowly, careful not to wake the infant sleeping beside him. "Tom, the child hasn't left this cabin. How could he be bait for anything? Because every Apache within 100 miles knows where he is." Pete Morrison pushed past the sheriff, his face twisted with grief and rage. "They've been watching this place, waiting for their chance. My brother's widow was killed 3 days ago, scalped and left for the buzzards while you've been playing house with that savage's spawn." The baby stirred at the raised voices, letting out a soft cry that seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence. Ezra reached out instinctively to comfort the child, but Brennan's sharp command stopped him. "Don't touch it. We're taking the baby to town, turning it over to the army. Let them decide what to do with Nalnish's nephew. You know what they'll do," Ezra said quietly. "You're signing his death warrant." "Better his death than more of ours," Brennan replied coldly. "Morrison, grab the baby." As Pete Morrison stepped forward, his face a mask of hatred, the world exploded into chaos. The cabin's back window shattered as Apache warriors poured through the opening, war cries echoing off the walls. Iron Wolf materialized like a ghost, his war hatchet catching the morning light as he buried it in Morrison's shoulder. Gunfire erupted in the confined space. Ezra rolled off his bed, snatching up Little Eagle and pressing the crying infant against his chest as bullets whined overhead. Through the smoke and chaos, he saw Sheriff Brennan go down with an Apache arrow in his thigh, saw Doc Hartley crumple as Iron Wolf's second blow found its mark. "The child!" Iron Wolf shouted over the gunfire. "Where is the child?" "Here!" Ezra called out, rising from behind his overturned table. "Stop this madness! You'll kill him in the crossfire!" The fighting ceased as suddenly as it had begun. Iron Wolf stood over Brennan's wounded form, his hatchet dripping red, while 3 of his warriors held the surviving white men at arrow point. The cabin reeked of gunpowder and blood. "Give me my nephew," Iron Wolf commanded, his chest heaving from battle. Ezra looked around at the carnage, 2 men dead, 3 wounded, and the baby in his arms crying from terror and confusion. This was what his protection had brought. More death, more hatred, more fuel for a war that would consume everything in its path. "No," he said firmly. Iron Wolf's eyes blazed with fury. "You see what your stubbornness has cost? Men are dead because you would not return what belongs to us. Men are dead because none of us can see past our own hatred long enough to find another way." Ezra stepped forward, still cradling the infant. "Look at him, Iron Wolf. Really look at him. Is this the world you want him to inherit? Blood and vengeance and endless war? It is the world the white man has given us. Then help me give him something different." Ezra's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Your sister chose to trust me with her son's life. Maybe she saw something we're all too blind to see." Sheriff Brennan struggled to sit up, his leg bloody but his gun still in his hand. "McKinnon, what the hell are you talking about?" Ezra looked from the wounded lawman to the Apache warrior, seeing the same pain and loss reflected in both their faces. "I'm talking about a child who doesn't have to choose between being Apache or white, who could grow up understanding both worlds, maybe even helping them find peace." "Peace?" Iron Wolf spat. "While the bluecoats hunt us like animals, while settlers steal our sacred places and turn them into cattle ranches, while Apache raiders burn out families and leave children orphaned," Brennan countered weakly. "Yes," Ezra said simply. "While all of that happens because someone has to break the cycle, someone has to choose hope over hatred." Little Eagle had stopped crying and was looking up at Ezra with those intelligent, dark eyes, as if the baby understood the weight of the moment. In the silence that followed, the sound of distant hoofbeats could be heard approaching fast. "Army patrol," Brennan said grimly. "Must have heard the gunfire." Iron Wolf's warriors looked to their leader, hands tightening on their weapons. The Apache could fight their way out, but not without more bloodshed and not without risking the child's life. "There's another way," Ezra said urgently. "Iron Wolf, take your men and go. I'll tell the army that raiders attacked us, that you fought them off and disappeared. But leave the child with me, not forever, but until this war burns itself out, until there's a chance for something better." "And if there never is?" Iron Wolf asked. "Then when he's old enough to choose, I'll bring him to you myself, I give you my word." The Apache warrior studied Ezra's face for a long moment, searching for deception or weakness. Outside, the hoofbeats were getting closer. "Your word, white man. What is that worth?" Ezra thought of his wife and son buried in the desert earth. He thought of Thunder, his faithful companion, still lying unburied outside. He thought of all the choices that had brought him to this moment, all the chances to choose hate over hope, vengeance over mercy. "It's worth whatever I have left to give," he said simply. Iron Wolf looked down at his nephew, then at the blood on his hatchet, then at the wounded white men who still watched him with fear and hatred. The sound of cavalry horses was almost upon them now. "If harm comes to him, it won't," Ezra promised. "Not while I draw breath." The Apache warrior nodded once, sharply, then gestured to his men. They melted through the back window as silently as they had come, leaving only the echo of their passing and the weight of a promise that would bind two men across the vast divide of race and culture. Minutes later, Captain James Morrison, Pete's younger brother, burst through the shattered door with a dozen cavalry troopers, their carbines ready for battle. He stopped short at the scene of carnage, his eyes taking in the wounded men and the baby in Ezra's arms. "What happened here?" he demanded. Ezra McKinnon looked down at Little Eagle, at Samuel, and made his choice. "Apache raiders hit us just before dawn," he said calmly. "They took some of your brother's men, but we drove them off. The baby was caught in the middle. He's an orphan now, parents killed in the raid. I figure he deserves a chance at something better than what took his family." Captain Morrison studied the infant's face, seeing only a child in need of protection. "Apache, half Apache," Ezra lied smoothly. "Mother was a Mexican woman captured years ago. Father was one of the raiders who didn't make it out alive." It was a story that made sense, that fit the brutal realities of frontier life. Captain Morrison nodded grimly and holstered his weapon. "We'll take the survivors back to town for medical attention. As for the baby," he paused, looking at Ezra with new respect. "Are you willing to raise him as your own?" Ezra felt Little Eagle's small hand curl around his finger with surprising strength, and for the first time in 10 years, he felt something like hope stirring in his chest. "Yes," he said quietly, "I reckon I am." As the cavalry prepared to leave with their wounded, Ezra caught a glimpse of movement on the distant ridge, a lone Apache warrior watching from the rocks. Iron Wolf raised one hand in what might have been farewell or promise, then disappeared into the vastness of the desert. That evening, as the sun set over his isolated ranch, Ezra McKinnon sat on his porch with Samuel, sleeping peacefully in his arms. Thunder still lay unburied beneath the mesquite tree, but somehow that seemed less important now. The old horse had given him years of faithful companionship. Now it was time to offer that same loyalty to a child who would need every bit of protection and love Ezra could provide. In the distance, coyotes began their nightly chorus, and the desert wind whispered secrets across the endless expanse of sand and stone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and the constant weight of keeping faith with both cultures that claimed this child. But tonight, for the first time since losing his family, Ezra McKinnon was not alone. And perhaps in the growing bond between a grieving rancher and an Apache child lay the seed of something that might one day bloom into understanding between two peoples who had forgotten how to see each other as anything more than enemies. The feather, the sacred eagle feather that had marked Little Eagle as special to his birth people, lay safely tucked away in Ezra's dresser drawer, waiting for the day when its meaning would be fully understood by the child who had once clutched it in his tiny fist. Until then, it would remain a symbol of hope in a harsh land, where hope was the rarest commodity of all.